A lot of cults redefine spiritual warfare, okay? And to a lot of cults, what spiritual warfare is, is that for them, it's like by any means necessary, you get them to like believe like you. And, with, you know, the Jehovah False Witnesses, the Mormons, the Muslims, they think it's totally okay to lie to people that don't believe like them if somehow that would further their cause. Like they think there's nothing wrong with that, okay? And they're taught that, okay? They're actually taught that. And in the case of the JWs, like they're the Watchtower Society, and they actually call that spiritual warfare, which is insane, right? So, obviously bearing false witness is, it's anti-God. I mean, the God of the Bible isn't a liar. So if you claim to believe in the true God, you know, you know, um, you know, would why do you think he expects you to lie? Like, you know what I mean? Like, it's demonic, is what it is. Now, the Calvinists, they go to even a further extreme, where not only are they cool with lies, you know, and I've been doing some community posts, right, about how, like Calvinists, once they get really sucked into Calvinism, once they become, like a 4 or 5 point Calvinist, they start to think that, right, they start to deny free will, which is retarded. And if you deny free will, what you're going to believe is that God literally controls everything, and that basically you're just like a puppet, okay? And that God pulls the strings. And, they like using the term God is sovereign. But to them, they think that, when they say God is sovereign, basically what they mean is that he literally controls every single aspect, of life. And no joke, that even like real evil things, they think that God in his sovereignty, like preordains, atrocities and stuff, like, and tragedies, and just, like, look, this is the weird mind of a Calvinist. They think every baby that was aborted, they believe that was like the sovereign will of God. Every baby that wasn't aborted but was born, and the mother just like abandoned the baby in a dumpster, they think that's the sovereign will of God. Every child that was molested, the Calvinists think that's the will of God. Okay, I mean, it's insane. Every woman that was raped, they think that's the will. Every person that was suffered a home invasion and was beat up and tied up and tortured, or had their stuff stolen. Every war that was started, the United States dropping nuclear bombs on Japan, like, the Calvinists think that that was like the sovereign will of God, and that nobody has any free will, and also because they think you don't have free will. They think that you can't believe the gospel, so they believe that God actually has to give you faith so that you will believe. And that's kind of like where the new heart thing comes in, that the Calvinists, teach. And they think that you're just incapable of believing the gospel, so they think God has to force you to believe, but he picks who believes from eternity past, which is also insane, because the flip side of unconditional election, as they call it, the flip side of that, and some of them won't say the quiet part out loud, but some of them actually do. I think Piper's talked about it out loud, right? And look it up. It's called unconditional damnation. Okay, that's the flip side of unconditional election, right? Because if God picks who's going to be saved from eternity past, well, then the flip side of that would be this insane view that he picked before people were even born who would go to hell. And that's insane, right? And that's heresy. And that, that mischaracterizes God, okay? And look, people who are crazy enough to believe that God picks before they're born who goes to hell, people who are crazy enough to believe that, they're crazy enough to believe a bunch of other weird stuff, including that, that God's like the author of, child molestation and stuff. It's insane. Okay. These people literally worship Satan. I mean, if you study what Calvinism is and the points and like, and if you just study those points and just like conclude, well, if these points were true, what would God be like? You think, well, he'd be Satan. Okay. Because look, Satan doesn't want people to believe the gospel. Okay. And Satan came to, lie and destroy and terrorize people. And because Satan doesn't want people to believe the gospel, of course he's going to try to convince people that they're just incapable of believing the gospel. Right? And, one of Satan's problems was obviously his pride, and that he wanted God to respect his person. And God's not a respecter of persons. And, if Calvinism were true, then God would be a respecter of persons. Okay. And also, if Calvinism were true, in Romans 1, where it talks about how everybody's left with no excuse because God gave two witnesses to everybody, the conscience and creation itself as witness that God's real. If Calvinism were true, then at the great white throne of judgment, everybody that wasn't saved would have an excuse, and they'd be able to say, well, you just didn't pick me, and I was just unable to believe because that's how you designed me. And look, that's damnable heresy. And and then Calvin, the more points you believe in Calvinism, the more more points in that tulip that you believe, the more likely you are to start believing all the points eventually. Because if you think people are just too wicked to believe and they're like, they have like no free will, that they're just totally depraved, right? Then you're going to have to believe in unconditional election, that God has to pick you, and you know, then you're going to think, well, if he has to pick you, then then has to be irresistible grace, and that you just can't refuse. And then they're going to think, well, if he picked you, then but not other people, then you know, then there's a limited atonement, which is also BS. Okay, but the Calvinists don't really think that Jesus died for everybody. That's crazy. He tasted death for every man, for God so loved the world that he gave his only begotten Son. Those who believe in him shall not perish but have everlasting life. Okay, but to the Calvinists, the world in John 3:16, they think it means the elect, which is them. Okay, because Calvinism messes with your mind to where you can't understand basic vocabulary in the Bible. And so, as you saw, right, if they think that, if somebody thinks that people are just too wicked to believe, and that then they're going to think, well, God has to make them believe, right? And then they're going to think, oh, that's not free will, and then they're going to think, well, then if God's going to make them believe, then it has to be irresistible, or else they, you know, because they're denying free will, and then they're going to say, well, you know, the limited atonement thing, and then they think, well, you know, they're going to think, well, if God picked me and I didn't have a choice, then and the irresistible grace thing, then they're going to think, well, of course I'm going to persevere to the end. You know, like, that's what they're going to conclude. And they're going to just think they're going to have the works. But interesting enough, you know, every good little Calvinist that like, you know, follows that has to admit that they don't know if they're one of the elect, because, you know, they don't know the end of their life, right? And so Calvinism really doesn't give you any assurance. And when a Calvinist says once saved, always saved, they don't mean it like how we do. They mean once saved, always saved, as long as you have the works. Which, you know, because if somebody backslides, like let's say somebody goes to like a Calvinist church, and they go there for years, and then they backslide and they leave that church or whatever. Well, all the other Calvinists in the church are going to think, are going to conclude, well, maybe that guy wasn't one of the elect. You know, because they think, oh, that guy didn't persevere to the end. And so look, they don't believe in the grace of God. They don't believe in the love of God. They don't believe in free will. They don't believe that salvation is a choice, and that it's offered to anybody as a gift, to everybody as a gift. They don't believe Jesus died for. I mean, how could you even go soul winning? How could you even evangelize? You know, like how could you walk up to some random person as a Calvinist and evangelize? Because like as a Calvinist, like you would be unsure if Jesus died for them. And as a Calvinist, like you couldn't even be 100% sure that Jesus died for you. Like how insane is that? And because they're not 100% sure, that's why they're trying to persevere to the end, because like they think if they can persevere to the end, then they think that's the proof that they're saved. You know, it's retarded, it's blasphemous, it's wicked, and it's just a mound of confusion. And there's so much hypocrisy in it, because, you know, I've talked about John Calvin, how he ran Geneva basically for a few years as a theocracy, Geneva, Switzerland, right? And, you know, he had people beheaded, he had people burned alive, he made it a crime for you to like laugh at his sermons. Yeah, I would have been such a criminal because that guy's such a joke. You know, he did like all these dress standards and stuff. He controlled basically how many like side dishes people could have during a meal because he was worried about them like becoming gluttonous or whatever. Well, I mean, it was very legalistic, how people dress, how people spoke. People would like get in trouble if they missed a church service. If I remember correctly, they would like be fined. Sometimes I think even beaten. And look, and he was such a hypocrite because, of course, he believed all 5 points, or at least preached it or whatever. But if there truly is no free will, and if some people are just damned to hell before they were even born, what's the point of trying to get everybody in a town to live under a theocracy? If you're just going to think, well, at least most of them are just going to fail because they were just, or destined to fail. I mean, that should have caused him to have a crisis in his theology, thinking about, why am I trying to, he but you know what? The reason he didn't have a crisis in his theology is because he thought he was a robot too, basically. So every atrocity that he did, he thought that was the will of God. And that's another reason why Calvinism is so dangerous, is because every wicked thing that you do, but if you believe in Calvinism, you excuse it because you just think that it's the will of God, and that was just ordained, and basically you think, well, he's sovereign. He did it. He allowed it to happen or whatever, and so that paints God into some monster, and but the God of Calvinism is Satan, okay? It's not Jesus Christ. It's so bad. Calvinism is so bad. And here's the thing, right? Like, the Calvinists now, and any of them that's read a book about John Calvin, like some of these YouTubers with smaller channels that they preach Calvinism, but they might not even know what it is because not only do they read the Bible, not only do they not really read the Bible, they'll listen to something that, by a Calvinist, but the guy won't say he's a Calvinist, but it appeals to their flesh because Calvinism's about pride, right? It's like, oh, you're one of the elect, you're one of the special people that God respects their person. I mean, so that's how a lot of people get sucked into Calvinism, is thinking that they're good enough for God to respect their person. That they were just destined to be better than so so some of these smaller YouTube channels that are basically starting to preach Calvinism, Like, they probably don't know that John Calvin ran a crazy theocracy in Geneva, right? And had people murdered and all this crazy stuff. But you know what? The guys that actually read like books that are Calvinists, like James White, John Piper, Paul Washer, John MacArthur, you know, the guy Spurgeon from the 1800s. They all know what Calvin did, and they excuse it, okay, and they minimize it, and they act like it really wasn't that bad. You know why they minimize it? Because, again, like, if you're crazy enough to believe that God preordains who goes to hell before they're even born, before they even sin, and that he just makes them a robot without any choices to where they can't even choose Christ, then of course you're going to think, well, John Calvin, you know, burning like 50 people alive, you're going to think that's no big deal. And in fact, that was just preordained by God. So, Calvinism, you run from that garbage. It's from the pit. And like it, and the creepiest thing about Calvinism is that it's more likely to affect a church that actually believes in eternal security and preaches the gospel and believes in grace. It's more likely to creep in unawares and slowly corrupt that church than something like Arminianism, that front loads works into the gospel and teaches that you could lose your salvation, you know, as a, you know, like front loaded. And right, because the Calvinists, they'll never say you could lose your salvation. They'll just say, oh, if you don't have the works, that's just proof that you weren't really chosen. Right, but an Arminianist would just say, oh, well, if you sin and you don't repent or whatever, like, you know, they'll say you could lose your salvation. So people who believe in grace, they'll look at somebody who's like preaching Arminian, like preaching that you could, like, it's way more obvious to them that that's heresy, okay? Because an Arminianist doesn't copy the language of grace, but the Calvinist copies the language of grace. And so people like let their guard down. You know, if you hear John MacArthur speak, he uses the word grace. I mean, his church is called, like, I think it's called like Grace Community Church or something like that. He uses the word grace, he uses the word faith, you know. I'm sure he used the term once saved, always saved before. I'm sure he uses, you know, talks about eternal security. You know, Paul Washer, he uses the word grace. They use the word gospel. But their gospel is a false one. And their God is not the God of the Bible. It's the devil.